First of all, we look at the opportunities in Nigeria's oil and gas space, particularly for local companies. I'm joined in the studio by Dayo Okusami. He's the Group General Counsel at Atlantic Energy. Dayo, it's good to have you on our show today for the first time. And like I mentioned, it's quite interesting to see what is going on in the oil and gas space this year. I think the biggest story really is the fact that indigenous companies are getting more involved. I'm hearing that it could be as much as 7% of production now. Your thoughts about how that is likely to ramp up going forward?
Yes, we've seen a growth in the indigenous participation by Nigerian companies by a raft of things, mostly led by the recent divestments of Shell of its onshore assets.
Right.
We understand currently that a couple of other IOCs are looking at rationalizing their portfolios. A couple have already started, and it would appear that those that would be interested in the most are the indigenous companies. So over the next 2 to 3 years to 5 years, you would be seeing more divestments by IOCs. These will be going to Nigerian companies, and that in turn just shifts the production from these companies to Nigeria.
And what do you think the market share would play out to be, say, in the next 3-5 years? Do you think it could move up to about 25%?
It could indeed, because if you look at what the current production of these IOCs are doing now, if you divide it between its onshore and its offshore, it's currently doing about 30 to 40% onshore. If just a fraction of that, if you say half of it, which is what we're hearing, goes to the Nigerian companies, then at least in the next 2 to 3 years, you're looking at doubling production from the indigenous companies. And in 5 years, you could triple that to around 20 to 25%. So I think that's pretty feasible.
You know, a lot of people are expecting that at some point we will see some of these oil companies listed on the stock exchange.
Yes.
And I imagine that the oil business is a highly capital intensive one.
It is.
Talk to us about your thoughts about how quickly we may see this transition where we'll see companies maybe coming to the stock exchange. There's been a lot of talk about that recently. Your thoughts on how soon this could happen?
I think this right now, I understand, and also from my previous life as a partner in a law firm, a number of companies have been exploring this for a few years now. There have been some barriers to entry on listing in the Nigerian Stock Exchange. However, the Nigerian Stock Exchange has led some incentives to encourage upstream indigenous companies to list on the Nigerian Stock Exchange. Currently, there aren't any strictly pure play upstream companies now. So they are gearing towards it. A number of them are preparing them for it. What I do know is that some of them are trying to take advantage by looking at dual listing options. But certainly in the next, I'd say 2 to 3 years, because I know some are just right there hoping to be able to take advantage of that. And with the capital market seemingly on a bounce, we could see that within the next year or two.
Of course, when everyone talks about the oil and gas space these days, the biggest discussion is around legislation.
Correct.
The petrol industry bill has been in Parliament for a while, passing through, so hopefully we would see that passed at some point this year. But specifically for indigenous companies, I want to get your thoughts on the big challenges that you have, because of course many of the IOCs have listed the fiscal terms as a main problem for them, the way that bill is presently constructed.
Yes. Well, for us, funnily enough, although from a different angle, for the indigenous companies, what we're looking at is fiscal incentives as well. Indigenous companies were encouraged in the past few years by the Nigerian government by giving fiscal incentives, a lower tax rate, royalty rate, and that sort of thing. In the current drafts, and I recognize it is a draft of the PIB, we haven't seen that. So as indigenous companies would want to see that legislated as part of the statute as well. We'd also like to see other lowering of barriers, so things like pioneer status, which you had outside the oil and gas industry, which could give you a tax-free period of 5 years from production. So for us, it all comes down to the money and the incentives, and that's what we'd like to see encapsulated and directed towards the indigenous companies and differentiated from the IOCs.
Right, so, but beyond the PIB, what other challenges are indigenous companies facing? I imagine capital is usually a challenge, but what I've noticed is that the banks have become quite aggressive about lending to the oil and gas space. But beyond that, I mean, we can also talk about the issue of insecurity in the Niger Delta. But for you, what are the big challenges there?
Well, the big challenges are getting the comfort level of the banks with the indigenous companies, and that's building expertise, which leads to my next thing, which is manpower development. We have a wide talent pool of Nigerians who are quite qualified in the area, but because the industry is expanding, because it is now tilting towards local content and hiring of more Nigerians, there is now a squeeze on the talent pool. So there is a challenge in getting young, bright Nigerians, especially on the technical side, trained up, and that's one of the challenges with the insecurity as well, because with Nigerian companies, you could argue that They have a better understanding of the local issues, but there are still issues that have to be dealt with mine and other indigenous companies.
Right, so your company is one of those exporting oil out of Nigeria now. There's always talk about shale oil and what that means for Nigeria's oil and gas space. I want to get your thoughts on that one.
Well, it's very important indirectly, because if you look at one of our large markets, which is the US, in 2000, there's a report that only 1% of domestic gas production was from shale gas. 2010, it had jumped up to 20%. There are figures that say by 2035, it could be up to 46. That's going to lead to a lowering of the gas we export to the US. China has reputedly one of the largest shale gas reserves. Now everyone looks at China for the next place that Nigeria's oil and gas is going to go, as well as with the rest of Asia. But if over the next 20 years they develop that, then the market in which you can export to has shrunk drastically. So we're going to have to give consideration to how that impacts on our market for the next 20 years.